Hello and welcome to this presentation. This is the penultimate presentation in Module 2. So we're in the course Professional Communication. Module 2 is about social communication essentials, and we've been looking at cross-cultural communication. So far we've covered things like stereotypes, ethnocentrism. So let's move on to the topic of today, complicated concept. We'll break it down. So we're going to look at cultural relativism. So the learning objectives for this presentation are to define what is meant by cultural relativism, to explain the practice of cultural relativism, and then consider how to achieve it. So this is very current debate, which is going on for a while. But before we get into the debate, let's have a look and just define our terms. So based on what we looked at before, we could say that cultural relativism is almost like the opposite of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is when you have one culture or point of view, and that is seen as central and as given primacy, and other cultures and backgrounds are seen as different and even wrong. But cultural relativism is the idea that there are no moral or cultural absolutes. So things are relative. There's no way we can say this is absolutely wrong and this is absolutely right. It all depends on your context and your perspective. So as I just said, this means there's no single correct or just fair way to act. There's no kind of single right answer to the questions of what we should do and how we should act in life. There's actually multiple answers to those questions. So therefore, any act or behavior should not be judged by the standards of the observer, but by the standards of the culture it's part of. So if you see something unusual happening, some kind of social practice or behavior, and you think that doesn't fit in, that's wrong from my point of view, you should actually try and put yourselves in the shoes of the people within the culture it's coming from to try and understand why that behavior is seen as normal or appropriate. So how does that play out in the real world, and specifically looking at a workplace? So how would a workplace that practice cultural relativism look? Well, extrapolating from those principles, we can see that relativism is linked to an idea of tolerance, but we should tolerate and accept other people's practices and beliefs. So we tolerate and respect behaviours different to their own. So like I said about the UK and those things about going to the pub or talking about football or eating lunch at your desk, a workplace of cultural relativism would say we should accept different ways of doing things in the same place. So we wouldn't necessarily enforce strict rules on how to behave, and that's probably a trend that has taken place, a certain casualization and greater tolerance in the workplace. And instead of things being set in one way, there's multiple ways of doing things which are accepted. So we'd accept that there are different ways to act, and therefore you would expect there to be more leniency regarding things like the dress code, food and drink, punctuality, work patterns, religious practice, customs and norms, etc. So all these things we've looked at time and time again and how we differ across cultures. A cultural relativistic workplace would actually accept those differences and try and accommodate those differences. So this is a question that I wanted to put here as a bit of a practical example, and this links back to things like ethnocentrism and stereotyping. I just wanted to pose this question: what does a businessman look like? If I say businessman to you, what image might pop into your head? And I actually used Google image search, and the image on the left was one of the first images that came up, and you could see that this is maybe Google image search revealing a certain ethnocentrism in that most of the results on the page were for white people, and we use the term businessman, which is gendered, it has the word man in, so it has found a male. The picture on the right is another example of a picture of a businessman. Now, from a white British ethnocentric point of view, a workplace or a school might have said, oh, this haircut is extreme, unusual hairstyle. To be professional, you need to look like this other person on my left of this screen and have a short professional haircut. But if you're African or Caribbean, you could have this kind of dreadlock hairstyle, and that's not an extreme, unusual statement haircut. That is just a normal, typical haircut in your culture, but you might be seen as being outside of being professional because of that haircut, and that would be a form of stereotyping or discrimination. So a cultural relativistic workplace would say either one is fine, whatever is normal for you, then that's appropriate for the business. But what are some of the limits of cultural relativism? Like any idea, it could be taken to extremes, and it has had plenty of critics over the time that this has become a popular strain of thought. So here are some of the critics. Some people would say actually there are some human values we all share, and that's any nation we're from, even any historical period, any cultural background or religion. And there's a list of these, but some of them are, for example, everyone values having a family, people enjoy having a cuisine, people have artistic culture like music and literature, there's a common fear of death, compassion for other people, etc., etc. So there are universal human values that everyone can agree upon. Those human values are the foundation of human behaviors, even if surface actions appear different. So like an example we've talked about, do people shake hands? Do they bow? Do they fist bump when they meet people? Well, those surface level cultural practices are different, but the fundamental thing we all share is that we want to acknowledge and communicate. So even if the surface is different, we all have a fundamental, some human values that we share, which is, an appealing idea. And then on the flip side of that, there are some acts that are universally seen as wrong and that should not be tolerated. So if cultural relativism says, oh, this culture does this thing and we should tolerate it because it's a different culture, well, most people would say actually there's something we just shouldn't tolerate, no matter what. So for instance, murder is quite an extreme example, but I don't think there's many societies in the world that would accept murder. That's quite an extreme example. Some of the more grey areas might be things like alcohol, drug use, capital punishment, and there's more of a debate, and some people would say these things are beyond the human condition, shouldn't be accepted, and some people would say actually some cultures do accept these things. That debate's raging. And I won't attempt to resolve that debate here. Another critique would say that outsiders coming into a majority group should accept the practices of that main group, and that's called an assimilationist argument. And there's the pros and cons in that, and I think in reality there will always be a degree of assimilation if minorities come to a majority group. And I suppose the question is, can you strike a balance between respecting minority differences and making the most of the mix of cultures you have, while also accepting that there will be some change towards assimilation potentially. So not many concrete answers, but an ongoing debate there. So in summary, what have we talked about in this presentation? We've discussed what is meant by cultural relativism, the idea that you cannot judge behaviors and practices and beliefs from one perspective, but you should allow yourself to consider the point of view of the culture that behavior came from and what it means within that culture. We talked about the limitations of that cultural relativism, and it has a lot of critics and it has limits, and the practice of how that might work in the workplace. And we talked about how to achieve it through respecting different behaviors and practices, and maybe understanding that respect comes within certain limits as well. So I think that's it for this presentation. So we have one more presentation to go until we finish module 2. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next presentation.